Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. It is an honor to have you back in our circle around the fire as we begin the fourth chapter of Where the Desert Remembers. If you rode with us through part 3, you witnessed an unforgettable battle between life and death. Silas Calloway braved the freezing mountain blizzard, bringing the ancient medicine of his mother's people to save his 3-year-old son, Jesse, from the lethal grip of mountain croup. And in the quiet aftermath of that storm, he held Elena in his arms, two souls finally finding peace before the glowing hearth. But on the frontier, peace is a fragile blossom that is easily crushed beneath an iron boot. When Silas stepped outside into the blinding morning sun, he found the ranch perimeter fence cleanly cut and fresh horseshoe tracks encircling the valley in the snow. Vance McCall's Iron River Syndicate has surrounded the canyon, using the blizzard as cover to bottle up the homestead and prepare for a coordinated, midwinter raid. With Caleb bedridden and Elena exhausted, Silas cannot risk a loud, chaotic shootout that would bring a barrage of lead crashing through the cabin walls. He must become what the army feared and what the desert created: a silent, lethal shadow walking through the frozen timber. The morning mist hung low and thick among the towering ponderosa pines, drifting like ghostly, translucent curtains through the snow-laden boughs. Above the canyon, the towering limestone spires of the Dragoon Mountains were shrouded in pale gray vapor, while below, 3 feet of fresh, powdery snow swallowed every sound, turning the forest into a silent, frozen cathedral. It was an eerie, breathless hush, the kind of winter stillness where the snapping of a single pine twig would echo like a rifle shot off the sandstone cliffs. Silas Calloway stood at the edge of the timberline, completely motionless, his back pressed against the massive, craggy trunk of a 200-year-old pine. He had not taken his Winchester repeater. A rifle was loud. Its iron action was noisy in the cold, and a single gunshot would wake Elena, terrify little Jesse, and signal the rest of McCall's syndicate gunmen scattered along the southern road to launch their full assault on the house. Instead, Silas had returned to the weapons of his youth, the silent, lethal instruments of the Chiricahua Scout. Slung across his broad, muscular back was a short, recurve hunting bow crafted from cured Osage orange wood, reinforced with layers of dried deer sinew and wrapped in supple rattlesnake skin to protect it from the moisture of the snow. At his hip hung a quiver of seasoned ashwood arrows, fletched with the barred tail feathers of a wild turkey and tipped with hand-hammered, razor-sharp steel broadheads. At his belt rested his antler-handled hunting knife, its heavy carbon blade honed to an edge so keen it could shave the hair from a man's forearm without a whisper. To conceal his dark silhouette against the blinding white wilderness, Silas had draped a winter-white wolf pelt over his shoulders, its frosted fur blending seamlessly into the snowbanks, while his deerskin moccasins were wrapped in thick strips of raw wool to muffle every footstep upon the crust of ice. He closed his eyes, tilting his head into the faint mountain draft, reading the forest with the supernatural sensory precision of an apex predator. He smelled it immediately. Drifting through the crisp, pine-scented air was the foul, unmistakable odor of civilization. The pungent, acrid stench of burning Kentucky plug tobacco, the sour smell of stale whiskey sweating through wool coats, and the faint, oily metallic tang of gun grease. 300 yards up the eastern ridge, tucked behind a cluster of red sandstone boulders overlooking the ranch house, 3 syndicate outriders were huddled in the timber. Silas opened his eyes, their dark riverstone depths turning cold, flat, and hard as obsidian flint. He stepped away from the tree, sinking into the deep snow with a fluid, soundless grace that defied his massive frame. He did not walk upright. He crouched low, moving in a rhythmic, serpentine glide that used the natural contours of the snowdrifts and the thick trunks of the evergreens for total concealment. Every movement was calculated, every breath measured and shallow, releasing small plumes of white vapor that vanished into the morning fog. Up on the rocky knoll, the 3 syndicate mercenaries believed they were completely alone and master of the ground. They were rough, seasoned killers, hired from the border saloons of Tucson men who wore heavy buffalo hide coats, broad-brimmed felt hats, and carried heavy Colt 6-shooters and lever-action carbines. Their 3 lathered horses were tied to a low juniper branch 30 yards behind them, stomping their hooves in the snow, their breath rising like steam kettles in the freezing air. The leader of the trio, a red-bearded gunman known as Red Cassidy, leaned against a flat rock, chewing on the stub of a cheap cigar, peering down through a brass telescope at the peaceful smoke rising from the chimney of the Sterling Ranch house. "House is dead quiet," Cassidy muttered, in a low, raspy whisper, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the pristine white snow. "The girl must be sleeping, and old Sterling is probably choking on his own blood by now. McCall says we wait for sundown. When the shadows hit the draw, we ride down, toss 4 bottles of kerosene through the front windows, and shoot anything that comes running out through the smoke." Beside him, a younger, skinny cowhand with a greasy bandana around his neck chuckled nervously, blowing on his gloved fingers to warm them. "What about that half-breed scout the drifter was talking about in town? Said he saw Calloway ride in 3 days back." Cassidy let out a dry, contemptuous sneer, waving his hand dismissively. "Calloway is dead, you fool. Army buried that redskin in Sonora 2 years ago. And even if his ghost is walking, one Indian ain't gonna stand against 12 men with repeating rifles. Now shut your mouth and keep your eyes on the corrals." 10 yards behind them, positioned high in the snow-laden branches of an ancient ponderosa pine directly above the tied horses, Silas Calloway looked down upon the men like an eagle watching wolves enter a canyon. He had climbed the tree from the blind side, moving through the thick boughs without disturbing a single clump of fresh snow. Silas looked down at the younger cowhand who had lingered near the horses to check a loose cinch. With the terrifying, explosive speed of a striking cougar, Silas dropped from the 12-foot branch. He landed directly behind the young gunman, his soft wool-wrapped moccasins making no more sound than a falling leaf hitting a snowbank. Before the young man could even register the shift in the air, Silas's massive, bronze left arm whipped around the man's throat in an iron sleeper hold, while his right hand clamped down over the man's mouth with crushing force. The cowhand's eyes widened in sudden blinding terror as his breath was cut off instantly. He tried to reach for the revolver at his hip, but Silas twisted his body with ruthless, mechanical leverage, driving his knee into the small of the man's back, while applying precise pressure to the carotid arteries in his neck. Within 6 seconds, the young man's limbs went limp, his eyes fluttering shut as unconsciousness claimed his brain. Silas lowered the unconscious body silently into a deep, soft snowbank beneath the juniper, pulled the man's Colt from its leather holster, emptied the brass cartridges into the snow with a flick of his wrist, and tossed the empty iron into the brush. 1 down, 2 remained. Silas unslung his recurve Osage bow from his back. He drew an ashwood arrow from his quiver, knocking the notched end onto the braided sinew string with smooth, silent mastery. He stepped from the cover of the juniper, positioning himself 15 paces behind the remaining 2 mercenaries, who were still staring down at the ranch house through their telescope. The second gunman, a burly, scarred border ruffian named Miller, suddenly frowned, shifting his feet in the snow. "Hey, Toby," Miller muttered, without turning around. "Bring me that bottle of rye from your saddlebag. My toes are freezing solid." No answer came from the trees. Miller frowned deeper, turning his head over his shoulder. "Toby, where the hell are you?" The words froze in Miller's throat. Standing in the white mist, 30 feet away, was a towering, terrifying vision of Apache vengeance. Silas Calloway stood anchored in the snow, his white wolf pelt draping over his shoulders, his long raven hair whipping in the freezing draft. His recurve bow was drawn to full draw, 60 pounds of cured wood and sinew arched in a lethal curve, the razor-sharp steel broadhead of the arrow aimed directly between Miller's eyes. Miller gasped, his hand dropping frantically toward the wooden grip of his 6-gun. Twib. The bowstring released with a soft, musical hum that was barely louder than a bird taking flight. The heavy ash arrow streaked through the freezing air with terrifying speed. It did not strike Miller's flesh. With superhuman marksmanship honed by a lifetime of hunting in the canyons, the steel broadhead slammed through the heavy wool collar and thick shearling sleeve of Miller's coat, burying itself 4 inches deep into the solid pine trunk behind him with a resonant, vibrating thunk. The impact pinned Miller violently against the tree, the heavy wood and steel trapping his right arm and collar against the bark like a butterfly pinned to a board. Before Miller could draw his gun with his left hand, Silas closed the distance in 3 blinding strides. Silas's right hand formed a rock-hard fist, driving the heel of his palm directly into Miller's jaw with bone-jarring, concussive force. Miller's head snapped back against the pine trunk, his eyes rolling back in his skull as his knees gave way, slumping unconscious in the snow, held upright only by the arrow pinning his sleeve to the timber. Red Cassidy heard the dull thud and spun around, dropping his brass telescope into the snow. His face turned the color of ashes as he saw both of his men neutralized in total silence without a single shot being fired. With a frantic curse, Cassidy reached for the pearl-handled Colt .45 strapped to his right thigh, his thumb pulling back the hammer with a sharp, metallic click. He never had the chance to level the barrel. Silas swept low, his heavy leg sweeping through the snow in a vicious, powerful arc that took Cassidy's boots out from under him. Cassidy hit the frozen ground on his back with a breathless oof, the revolver flying from his hand, landing 10 feet away in a snowdrift. Before Cassidy could even draw a breath to scream for help, a heavy, wool-wrapped knee drove down onto his sternum, pinning him to the frozen earth with the weight of a mountain, while the cold, razor-sharp edge of Silas's heavy hunting knife was pressed firmly against the pulsating artery beneath his red beard. The silence of the snowy woods rushed back in, heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Cassidy lay pinned in the snow, staring up into the face of the man kneeling over him. He had expected an Indian savage. He found himself staring into the eyes of a master warrior, eyes that were dark, ancient, and filled with a cold, terrifying intelligence that made Cassidy's blood turn to ice water. Silas did not tremble. He did not breathe heavily. He held the razor-sharp steel against the red-bearded throat with a steady, lethal authority that left no doubt that a single twitch would open the man's throat from ear to ear. "You speak one loud word," Silas whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that was colder than the mountain frost, "and your blood will melt the snow before you finish the sentence. Do you understand me?" Cassidy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the sharp blade, feeling the terrifying prick of steel breaking the surface of his skin. He gave a tiny, frantic nod, his knuckles clutching the snow in sheer, unadulterated terror. "Who sent you?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. "Vance McCall." Cassidy stammered in a terrified, trembling whisper, his tough guy bravado completely shattered. "Vance McCall. He's at the border stage station with 9 more men. He told us to bottle up the canyon, told us to burn the spread tonight." Silas leaned in closer, his dark riverstone eyes boring straight through Cassidy's soul, his bronze face framed by the white wolf pelt like a spirit of the winter wild. "You listen to me, gunman," Silas spoke, his words landing like iron spikes into the freezing air. "You go back to Vance McCall. You tell him that Private Silas Calloway has walked out of his grave. You tell him that the Blackwood Canyon belongs to the Chiricahua and the woman who holds this land." Silas pressed the blade a fraction deeper, drawing a single, bright bead of crimson blood that dripped onto the white snow. "You tell McCall that if another syndicate boot crosses that fence line, if another bullet is fired toward that house, I will not use ropes and I will not call the territorial marshal. I will hunt every last one of you through these mountains until there is nothing left of the Iron River Syndicate but bones for the buzzards. Now get on your horse and ride." Silas rose to his feet, stepping back into the mist. Cassidy scrambled up from the snow like a terrified dog, his boots slipping on the ice as he ran toward his bay horse. Before Cassidy could grab the reins, Silas stepped up to the saddle. With 3 swift, brutal strokes of his hunting knife, Silas slashed through the saddle strings and drove the point of his blade deep into the heavy leather horn of the saddle pommel. With expert, ancient strokes, Silas carved a deep, jagged symbol into the leather, the sacred Chiricahua cross of the 4 winds, flanked by 2 stylized eagle feathers and a slashed wolf claw, the unmistakable, terrifying battle mark of a Warm Springs Apache war scout. Silas grabbed Cassidy by the collar of his coat, hurled the terrified mercenary up into the saddle, and delivered a stinging slap of his open hand to the horse's muscular flank. The horse reared, let out a high, startled whinny, and plunged down the snowy ridge in a frantic, snow-flinging gallop, carrying the weeping, panic-stricken gunman back down the southern road toward Blackwood Creek to deliver the warning to his master. Silas stood on the crest of the ridge, watching the horse and rider disappear into the white fog of the lower valley. He turned back toward the 2 unconscious gunmen lying in the snow. Working with swift, cold efficiency, Silas used their own leather lariats to bind their hands and feet securely behind their backs, tying them to the sturdy trunks of 2 pine trees where they would be sheltered from the wind until the town sheriff came looking for his missing outriders. He gathered their 6 guns and carbines, removed the firing pins with his hunting knife, and buried the useless iron deep in a snowdrift 50 yards away. When the ridge was clear and the perimeter secured, Silas walked to the edge of the granite bluff overlooking the home valley. The morning sun had finally burned away the heavy gray fog, flooding the Blackwood meadows in a radiant, blinding wash of pure golden light. Down in the basin, the sturdy log ranch house stood peaceful and unbroken beneath the towering cottonwoods. From the stone chimney, a thin, fragrant ribbon of blue cedar smoke curled up into the turquoise sky. Through the clear mountain air, Silas saw the front door open. Elena stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in her woolen shawl, carrying a tin cup of fresh water for the morning wash. She looked up toward the high, snow-laden pine timber of the eastern ridge, looking toward the exact spot where he stood. She could not see him. He was a white shadow among the snow and the pines. Yet, as Silas looked down upon her, feeling the steady, powerful thumping of his warrior's heart against his ribs, a deep, protective ferocity filled his soul. He had neutralized the scouts. He had bought his family precious time. He turned his eyes toward the south, where the road wound through the white hills toward the border, knowing with every instinct of his blood that Vance McCall would not heed the warning. When night fell, the syndicate would bring the full fury of their hired guns to burn the valley. Silas unslung his bow, checked the sinew string, and began his silent descent through the timber toward the frozen creek. The winter of the wolf had truly begun, and before the snows of the Dragoon Mountains melted into spring, the blood of the wolves would water the roots of the land he had sworn to protect. By mid-afternoon, the harsh, unforgiving grip of the winter freeze began to yield to the gentle mercy of a high mountain thaw. The Arizona sun climbed into the center of an immaculate, radiant dome of turquoise sky, spilling its rich, golden warmth across the snow-draped basin of the Blackwood Valley. Along the southern banks of Whispering Creek, where the tall limestone bluffs sheltered the water from the biting northern breeze, the thick shelves of crystalline ice began to soften. Long, translucent icicles hanging from the drooping branches of the ancient weeping willows dripped steadily into the snow, sparkling like showers of liquid diamonds in the brilliant afternoon light. The creek, freed from its icy prison, sang a loud, musical song of resurrection. Crystal-clear mountain runoff rushed briskly over smooth, black river stones, swirling in dark, deep pools where wild watercress clung to the submerged granite, filling the crisp winter air with the sweet, clean melody of running water. From the wide front porch of the ranch house, Elena Whitfield stepped down onto the shoveled path, carrying a heavy, copper-banded wooden water bucket. She was dressed in her deep forest-green woolen dress, her heavy homespun shawl draped securely over her shoulders against the lingering chill. The brisk mountain air brought a rich, healthy rose flush to her high cheekbones, and though her face bore the faint, delicate shadows of the exhausting night she had endured, her hazel eyes glowed with a profound, luminous peace. Inside the quiet house, a fragile sanctuary had taken hold. Little Jesse, fully restored by the ancient OSHA medicine, was sitting happily upon a thick sheepskin rug before the parlor hearth, chattering to himself in a sweet, childish murmur as he made his hand-carved cedar wolf leap over pine building blocks. In the back bedchamber, Caleb lay in a deep, healing sleep, his breathing quiet and steady, his fever cooled by the herbal teas Silas had prepared before dawn. Elena walked slowly down the packed snow path that wound past the corrals toward the natural stone well, nestled inside the dense willow grove beside the creek. Every step she took was filled with an exquisite, restless tension that made her heart flutter against her ribs. She had felt him. All morning, while she swept the hearth and fed her son, she had felt Silas's presence lingering like a warm, protective spirit at the edge of the timber. She had seen the fresh tracks in the shoveled yard, she had noticed the clean cuts on the firewood neatly stacked on the porch, and she had felt the subtle, electric awareness in her blood that told her the man who held her soul was near. Elena reached the stone well beneath the weeping willows. She set the wooden bucket upon the snow-crusted stone coping, reached for the iron crank, and lowered the heavy oak bucket down into the dark, sweet depths of the mountain spring. The iron chain rattled with a rhythmic, metallic music that echoed softly through the silent grove. As she reached down to grasp the rope to haul the water up, a shadow separated itself from the craggy trunk of a massive, snow-laden cottonwood 10 paces away. The movement was so silent, so completely devoid of sound, that it was as if the winter mist itself had condensed into the form of a man. Elena froze. Her breath caught in her throat in a soft, trembling gasp, her hands lingering on the hemp rope. Silas Calloway stepped into the warm, golden sunlight, filtering through the willow branches. He had removed his white wolf pelt and his hunting bow, leaving them concealed in the high rocks. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, and magnificent in his faded blue cavalry scout's coat, the heavy cartridge bandolier crossing his chest, his antler-handled hunting knife resting at his hip. His long, raven hair was tied back with a strip of buckskin, catching the sun like polished obsidian, and his bronze, sculpted face bore the quiet, lethal calm of a warrior who had just cleared the perimeter of wolves. Yet, as his dark riverstone eyes lifted and locked onto hers, the dangerous, predatory hardness in his gaze melted into an ocean of breathtaking, unvarnished tenderness. "Silas," Elena whispered, the word carrying all the reverence of a prayer. Silas did not speak. He crossed the few feet of snow between them with 3 long, deliberate strides. He reached out, his large, scarred, sun-darkened hands gently covering her cold, trembling fingers where they held the well rope. The instant his warm, calloused skin touched hers, a violent, electric shiver raced up Elena's arm, straight to the center of her heart. With effortless strength, Silas hauled the sloshing bucket of sweet spring water from the depths of the stone well, setting it aside onto a dry river rock. Then, he turned back to her. For a long, suspended heartbeat, they simply stood facing each other in the golden seclusion of the willow grove. The 3-year wall of silence, the horror of the War Department's lie, the bitter tragedy of Caleb's illness, and the looming shadow of the syndicate war all hung in the air between them, a heavy, suffocating mountain of sorrow that they had carried in silence for far too long. Silas reached out, his rough, scarred palms slowly, reverently rising to cup the sides of her flushed face. His long fingers slid into the thick, soft waves of her honey chestnut hair, his thumbs gently brushing across the high curve of her cheekbones, feeling the delicate tremor running through her lips. The touch was too much for Elena's battered heart to bear. The dam of 3 years of agonizing, solitary grief broke wide open within her chest. A choked, broken sob tore from her throat, and she stepped into him, her hands reaching up to grip the lapels of his heavy wool coat, her forehead pressing hard against his broad, muscular chest. "I was so alone, Silas," she wept, her voice trembling with the raw, uncaged agony of the past. "You don't know the darkness. You don't know the terrifying hollow silence of that cabin when the wind howled at night. I used to sit by that cold hearth, holding your knife, staring at the door until my eyes burned, begging the Almighty to give me just 1 more hour with you." She tilted her head back, looking up into his dark, fierce eyes through a blinding veil of hot, streaming tears that fell like melted amber onto his scarred thumbs. "Every night I lay in the dark," Elena choked out, her voice breaking with an intensity that shook her entire frame. "Every prayer I spoke in the dark was your name, Silas. I didn't pray for food. I didn't pray for the winter to end. I prayed for your soul. And I screamed your name into the ceiling until my voice was gone. Do not leave me again, Silas. I swear to you, on our son's life, I cannot survive this world without you." The words shattered the last remnants of Silas's iron restraint. A low, guttural sound of pure, unbridled devotion tore from deep within his chest. He did not just pull her into his arms. He swept her into the sheltered heart of the willow grove, where the drooping, ice-jeweled branches formed a private, golden cathedral, hidden completely from the view of the ranch house and the high mountain trails. He backed her gently against the wide, sun-warmed trunk of an ancient weeping willow, his massive, powerful frame pressing against hers, trapping her in the warm, unbreakable sanctuary of his body. His large hands tangled fiercely into the heavy silk of her chestnut hair, tilting her face up to his dark riverstone eyes blazing with an unquenchable, primal fire that had burned through 3 years of war, bullet wounds, and frozen mud. "I am never leaving you, Elena," Silas rasped, his deep baritone trembling with a fierce, absolute conviction that shook the very ground beneath their boots. I would tear the mountains down before I let them take you from me." And with those words, Silas brought his mouth down upon hers. The kiss was an explosion of pure, consuming, and untamed passion, a collision of two starving souls claiming their sacred right to live. It was not a gentle, hesitant reunion. It was fierce. It was hungry. It was filled with the raw, desperate ferocity of a warrior reclaiming the only treasure that gave his life meaning, and the wild, uninhibited surrender of a woman who had waited an eternity to be loved by the only man she would ever worship. Silas tasted the sweet salt of her streaming tears, the hot, intoxicating warmth of her mouth, and the breathless, panting cries that escaped her lips as his mouth moved over hers with demanding, all-encompassing devotion. His strong arms wrapped around her slender waist and the small of her back, lifting her slightly off the snow, crushing her soft body against the rock-hard wall of his chest, with an intensity that left no space between them for doubt, sorrow, or memory. Elena clung to him with a desperate white-knuckled strength, her arms wound tightly around his muscular neck, her fingers tangling into the thick raven waves of his hair, pulling him down, pressing herself against him, as if she were trying to pour her entire soul through her lips into his. She kissed him with a wild, breathless hunger that matched his own, her mouth parting beneath his, surrendering completely to the intoxicating taste of cedar smoke, pine resin, mountain frost, and the pure, unvarnished essence of the man she loved. The world outside the willow grove ceased to exist. The cold winter air, the threat of the syndicate, the gold ring upon her finger, the town's cruel hatred, all of it was incinerated in the blinding, holy fire of their embrace. Silas broke the kiss for a fraction of a second, his chest heaving with ragged, shuddering gasps of air, his forehead resting against hers. His dark eyes, fierce and dark as a hunting hawk's, searched her flushed, tear-stained face with an intensity that made her knees tremble. His rough, calloused hands moved down from her hair, his thumbs tracing the soft line of her jaw, the sensitive curve of her neck, sliding beneath the heavy woolen collar of her green dress. His warm fingers brushed against the leather thong around her throat, finding the heavy, sky-blue stone of Kingman turquoise resting against her chest. He pulled the amulet out into the golden sunlight, holding the polished stone between their bodies. The raw blue rock caught the afternoon sun, glowing with a deep, azure radiance that seemed to mirror the cloudless Arizona sky above. "You kept it," Silas whispered, his voice thick, with a reverence that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Through the cold, through the starvation. You kept the sky stone." Elena reached up, placing her small, warm hand over his large, scarred fingers, pressing the cool turquoise firmly against the rapid, thumping pulse of her heart. "It was the only piece of you the army couldn't take from me, Silas," Elena whispered, her hazel eyes gazing into his with an unshakable, eternal devotion. "When I was freezing in that draw, when Jesse kicked inside me for the first time, I held this stone and I remembered your voice in the canyon of the Red Moon. I remembered your promise. This stone kept my heart beating when my body wanted to surrender." Silas looked down at the stone, then looked into the eyes of the woman who had carried his world through hell upon her own shoulders. He leaned down, his lips brushing softly, reverently against the turquoise amulet resting in the hollow of her throat, kissing the blue stone with the sacred devotion of a Chiricahua prayer. Then, his mouth moved upward, trailing burning, tender kisses along the soft line of her neck, over the curve of her jaw, until his lips captured hers once more in a deep, slow, and breathtakingly tender kiss that sealed their eternal covenant anew. It was a kiss of restoration, a kiss that washed away the bitter dust of the war, the blood on his hands, and the lonely tears she had wept in the dark. When their lips finally parted, the afternoon sun had begun to dip toward the western rim of the Dragoon Mountains, casting long golden amber rays through the dripping willow branches. They stood together in the quiet sanctuary of the grove, their breathing slowing into a shared, peaceful rhythm. Silas kept his arms securely wrapped around her waist, holding her close against his chest, sheltering her from the cool mountain breeze that was beginning to stir the tree boughs. Elena rested her cheek against the rough wool of his scout coat, her eyes closed, her hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his heartbeat, an anchor of pure iron that made her feel safer than any stone fortress in the territory. "Jesse asked about you this morning, Silas," Elena murmured softly, a tender, loving smile touching her lips. Silas looked down at her, his dark riverstone eyes softening with immediate, paternal warmth. "What did he ask, little bird?" "He held up the wooden wolf you carved for him," Elena said, looking up into his face. "He looked at the sky and asked if the brave Apache warrior who made the wolf was coming to teach him how to ride a horse." A deep, rumbling laugh escaped Silas's chest, a sound so rich, so full of pure, unadulterated joy that it seemed to warm the very air around them. "Tell him his father is already saddling the pony," Silas whispered, kissing the crown of her brow. Elena smiled through her tears, reaching down to take the heavy wooden water bucket from the rock. She looked at Silas, her hazel eyes filled with a new, unbreakable strength. She was no longer a grieving widow hiding from the world. She was the woman of Silas Calloway, a wife adored, a mother protected, and a soul reborn. "Caleb is resting," Elena said softly, stepping toward the edge of the grove. "I must go in and prepare the evening broth for him and Jessie. But tonight, when the sun goes down, you will be near?" Silas stepped up beside her, his hand gently squeezing her shoulder with an iron, protective reassurance that left no room for fear. "I will be on the eastern ridge, Elena," Silas promised, his voice an unyielding vow. "I am watching every trail. I am watching every shadow. Go to our boy. Keep the hearth fire burning. The wolves will never cross this creek while I draw breath." Elena looked at him one last time, her lips parting in a radiant, breathless smile, before turning to walk up the snowy path toward the warm, welcoming chimney smoke of the ranch house. Silas stood in the golden light of the willow grove, his dark eyes watching her every step until the heavy oak door closed securely behind her. He looked down at his right hand, the hand that had just held the turquoise amulet against her heart, and then he looked toward the southern road, where the shadows were beginning to lengthen across the snow. The flame that had been lit beneath the red moon 4 years ago had not died. It was burning brighter, hotter, and more fierce than ever before. And for that flame, Silas Calloway was ready to set the entire Arizona frontier ablaze. The sudden mountain thaw that brought life back to Whispering Creek transformed the frontier town of Blackwood Creek into a treacherous, churning quagmire of mud and ice. Along Main Street, the 3 feet of pristine mountain snow had dissolved into a knee-deep mire of freezing red-brown sludge, churned by the heavy iron wheels of freight wagons and the stomping hooves of freight mules. Gray, dirty slush dripped relentlessly from the wooden eaves of the false front buildings, splashing onto the warped planks of the boardwalks where the townsfolk walked with their collars turned up and their heads cast down. A suffocating, tense gloom hung over the town, a silence born not of peace but of fear. Vance McCall's syndicate had cast its dark, heavy shadow across every business, every bank ledger, and every public office in the county trends. His armed enforcers, rough, heavily armed border cutthroats, who wore low-slung revolvers and took what they pleased, loitered outside the saloons, their cold, arrogant stares daring any decent citizen to meet their eyes. The town marshal had long since retreated behind his locked office door, pocketing the syndicate's gold and looking the other way as McCall's wolves tightened their grip on the territory. Through this sea of freezing mud, a lone rider approached the center of the town square. It was Caleb Sterling, riding his tall bay gelding. The rancher was bundled in his heavy shearling coat, but even the thick wool could not hide the devastating toll the white plague was taking on his body. He sat hunched in the saddle, his breathing shallow and rattling, his leathery face pale as bleached bone, his knuckles gray as he gripped the leather reins. He had ridden into town despite his fever, despite Elena's desperate pleas, driven by a singular, unyielding purpose that was stronger than death itself. Tucked securely inside the interior pocket of his coat, wrapped in oiled sheepskin, was the newly drawn territorial deed to the Blackwood water rights. Caleb knew his days on this earth were numbered in hours, not months. He knew that before his lungs surrendered their final breath, he had to walk into the Territorial Land Records office, place that document into the official county register, and legally transfer every spring, every meadow, and every acre to Elena and little Jessie. It was the final, sacred shield he could forge for his family. Caleb reined in his horse outside the Land Records office, stepping down from the stirrup with slow, agonizing effort. His boots sank into the freezing slush of the street as he reached for the wooden handrail of the boardwalk, using all his remaining strength just to pull himself up onto the dry planks. He took 3 labored steps toward the heavy oak door of the office. Suddenly, the side door of the adjoining assay office swung open. 4 men stepped out onto the boardwalk, blocking Caleb's path. At the head of the group stood Vance McCall. The syndicate boss was a tall, imposing man in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored black broadcloth suit, a silk brocade vest, and a heavy beaver fur overcoat. His silver watch chain glinted in the pale winter sun, and beneath his wide-brimmed Stetson, his cold, pale gray eyes bore the cruel, predatory amusement of a wolf that has cornered a wounded stag. Flanking him were 3 of his most ruthless enforcers, heavy, bearded gunmen, with sawed-off shotguns cradled in their arms and ivory-handled revolvers tied to their thighs. "Well, now," McCall said, his smooth, cultured voice dripping with venomous mockery as he blew a cloud of expensive blue cigar smoke into the freezing air. "Look what dragged itself out of the sickbed. Old man Sterling, looking like he's already got 1 boot in a 6-foot pine box." Caleb stopped on the boardwalk, his hand clutching the lapel of his coat over the legal packet. He drew a ragged, wheezing breath, lifting his chin with the proud, unbroken dignity of a frontier cattleman. "Get out of my way, McCall," Caleb said, his voice faint, hoarse, but steady as an oak post. "I have business with the county clerk." McCall let out a low, dry chuckle, stepping forward, his heavy, silver-tipped cane tapping against the wooden planks. "You don't have any business in this town, Caleb," McCall sneered, his eyes dropping to the bulge beneath Caleb's coat. "Except the business of signing over the Blackwood water rights to the Iron River Syndicate. You're a dying man, Sterling. You won't live to see the spring grass come up. Why don't you save yourself a lot of pain? Take the $500 in silver my boys have in the wagon and sign the bill of sale like a sensible man." Caleb looked Vance McCall dead in the eye, his pale blue gaze burning with an unshakable, righteous fire. "You won't get a single drop of Whispering Creek, McCall," Caleb rasped, his voice rising with unyielding defiance. "Not for $500. Not for $50,000. That land belongs to my family, and as long as I have breath in my body, no crooked syndicate will ever put a fence across that water." McCall's pleasant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, murderous sneer. "You don't have family, Sterling," McCall hissed, stepping into Caleb's face. "You have a squaw widow and a half-breed bastard who have no legal right to spit in this territory. And since you won't listen to reason," McCall snapped his fingers. The largest of the enforcers, a massive 6'4" border ruffian known as Grizzly, lunged forward. With a brutal, vicious shove of both hands, the giant slammed his palms directly into Caleb's chest. The impact was devastating to the frail, fever-racked rancher. Caleb was thrown backward off the boardwalk, his feet losing their purchase on the slippery wood. He crashed violently into the freezing, foot-deep mud of Main Street, his hat flying into the sludge, his head striking the iron rim of a parked wagon wheel with a sickening, dull thud. A violent, catastrophic spasm of coughing seized Caleb's chest. He doubled over on his side in the freezing slush, gagging and heaving, coughing dark crimson blood into the red mud as he struggled desperately to rise. From the boardwalk, the townsfolk who were watching from the windows of the mercantile, the bakery, and the saloon gasped in horror. Yet not a single shopkeeper moved. Not a single deputy drew his weapon. The fear of Vance McCall had paralyzed the entire town. McCall stepped down from the wooden boardwalk, his expensive leather boots sinking into the slush. He walked over to where Caleb lay gasping in the mud. With a cold, sadistic grin, McCall kicked Caleb's fallen hat deep into the muck, reached down, and ripped the oiled sheepskin packet containing the water deed straight from Caleb's coat pocket. McCall tossed the deed to one of his gunmen, then reached into his inside vest pocket, bringing forth a pre-written quitclaim deed and a silver fountain pen. McCall raised his heavy, polished boot and planted it firmly onto the center of Caleb's chest, pressing the dying rancher down into the freezing mud with crushing, humiliating weight. "Here's how this ends, Sterling," McCall snarled, leaning down over him, pressing the cold steel barrel of a derringer against Caleb's temple. "You sign this transfer of title right now, in front of the whole damn town. Or I pull this trigger, drop you in the mud, and take the ranch anyway while your widow starves in the draw." Caleb looked up through the blood and mud on his face, his teeth clenched, spitting a mouthful of red blood directly onto the toe of McCall's leather boot. "Go to hell, McCall," Caleb wheezed through his teeth. McCall's face flushed with murderous rage. His finger tightened on the Derringer's trigger. "Then die in the dirt, you stubborn son of a." He never finished the sentence. From the narrow, shadowy alleyway between the dry goods store and the livery stable, a sound cut through the slushy silence of Main Street. It was not the sound of a gun. It was the terrifying, explosive roar of an apex predator striking from the darkness. Silas Calloway launched himself from the alley, like a mountain lion diving from a high granite ledge. He had ridden down the mountain trails parallel to Caleb, shadowing his brother from the high ridges, knowing that the wolves would gather the moment the rancher set foot in town. Silas was wearing his faded cavalry scout coat, his long raven hair whipping wild in the winter wind, his dark riverstone eyes blazing with a lethal, terrifying ferocity that froze the blood of every man on the street. In the fraction of a second, before McCall's gunman could even register the blur of motion, Silas closed the 20-foot distance. His first strike was a masterpiece of Chiricahua close-quarters warfare. Silas grabbed the sawed-off shotgun held by the giant enforcer Grizzly. With a lightning-fast, bone-snapping twist of his muscular wrists, Silas leveraged the heavy iron barrel backward. Crack! The giant's right wrist shattered with a sound like dry firewood snapping in two. Grizzly let out a high-pitched, agonizing howl of pain, dropping the shotgun into the mud. Before the giant could recover, Silas drove the heel of his heavy deerskin-wrapped boot straight into the side of Grizzly's kneecap. The joint dislocated with a sickening pop, sending the 6'4" mercenary crashing face-first into the freezing mud, completely neutralized in less than 2 seconds. The second gunman, standing to McCall's left, frantically drew his Colt .45 from its leather holster, cocking the hammer as he tried to bring the barrel up to Silas's chest. Silas did not draw a weapon. He moved inside the man's guard. Silas swept his left forearm up, deflecting the gun barrel toward the sky, just as the weapon discharged with a deafening boom, the bullet harmlessly shattering a second-story window of the hotel above them. In the same fluid, unbroken motion, Silas grabbed the gunman by his shearling lapels, pivoted on his heel, and hurled the 200-pound man through the air with terrifying, explosive leverage. The gunman crashed violently through the wooden hitching rail outside the land office, splintering the heavy oak beam in half, hitting the boardwalk and lying motionless, knocked cold into the splintered wood. Vance McCall spun around in blind panic, raising his derringer to fire. He was far too slow. Silas closed the distance in a single, devastating stride. Holding his heavy Winchester repeater by the barrel in both hands, Silas swung the solid, steel-capped walnut stock of the rifle in a brutal, horizontal arc. Crunch! The solid walnut stock struck Vance McCall directly across his left ribs with the force of a swinging sledgehammer. The sound of 4 ribs shattering echoed across the entire town square like the crack of a bullwhip. The air exploded from McCall's lungs in a high, strangled shriek of sheer agony. The derringer flew from his hand, spinning 10 feet through the air into a water trough, and McCall was lifted completely off his feet by the sheer momentum of the strike, flying backward through the air before crashing hard onto his back in the freezing, red-brown mud beside Caleb. The fourth gunman, holding the stolen deed, took one look at his 3 companions broken and bleeding in the mud, dropped the oiled sheepskin packet like it was burning coal, scrambled onto his horse, and dug his spurs in, fleeing down the street in a cloud of flying slush. The entire town of Blackwood Creek fell into a dead, terrified silence. The only sounds were the heavy, ragged gasps of Vance McCall, clutching his shattered ribs in the mud, crying out in whimpering agony, and the soft, steady dripping of melted snow from the wooden boardwalks. Silas stood in the center of the muddy thoroughfare, straddling the fallen body of Caleb Sterling like an unbreakable bronze shield. With a movement so fast, so smooth, and so practiced that it seemed like sorcery, Silas reached down to his hip. His right and left hands drew twin heavy Colt .45 cavalry revolvers from their worn leather sheaths. With a single, synchronized snap of his scarred thumbs, Silas pulled back the heavy iron hammers of both revolvers. Clack, clack. The twin metallic clicks rang out across the frozen square with the absolute, chilling authority of a firing squad. Silas lowered the heavy, blued steel barrels, pointing the right revolver directly between the eyes of Vance McCall whimpering in the mud, and the left revolver toward the terrified town marshal who was slowly backing out of his office doorway. Silas stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his chest heaving with controlled, rhythmic breaths, looking down upon the syndicate boss with eyes that were ancient, cold, and entirely devoid of mercy. "You touch this man again, McCall," Silas spoke, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the very timber of the buildings, "and I will not use the law. I will not use a judge. I will take your scalp on the porch of your own bank, and I will feed your flesh to the wolves on Eagle Mesa." Vance McCall lay shivering in the freezing mud, clutching his broken side, his face gray with agonizing pain and absolute, unadulterated terror. He looked up at the scarred, imposing warrior standing over him with cocked revolvers, and he knew with every instinct of his cowardly soul that this man was not bluffing. This was the ghost of the frontier, a warrior who had conquered the grave and held the power of life and death in his hands. I'm leaving. Don't shoot," McCall whimpered, coughing up blood, crawling backward through the red sludge like a crushed beetle. Silas did not lower the guns until McCall and his groaning, broken enforcers had dragged themselves across the street into the shelter of the saloon. Across the entire town square, the people of Blackwood Creek stood frozen on the boardwalks. The storekeepers, the teamsters, the bank clerks, and the churchwomen who had gathered on the steps of the mercantile stared in absolute, breathless awe at the scene before them. They had cursed this man. They had called him a savage, a renegade half-breed who belonged in the dirt, a creature of violence who brought only ruin. Yet, as they looked out into the muddy street, they saw the undeniable truth. In a town full of white men who claimed to be civilized, in a town full of Christians who preached about brotherhood while looking the other way, as a dying man was beaten in the mud, the only man who possessed true honor, the only man who possessed the courage to bleed for justice, was the Apache warrior they had tried to bury. Silas uncocked the hammers of his revolvers with a smooth flick of his thumbs and slid the heavy iron back into their holsters. He knelt in the freezing mud beside Caleb. With a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of the women watching from the boardwalks, Silas gently gathered the dying rancher into his massive, powerful arms. He used the sleeve of his own wool coat to wipe the blood and the red mud from Caleb's weathered face, picking up Caleb's fallen hat from the muck, shaking the snow from the brim, and placing it gently back upon his brother's head. Silas picked up the oiled sheepskin packet containing the water deed from the mud, tucking it securely back inside Caleb's breast pocket. "The deed is safe, Caleb," Silas whispered softly, his deep voice thick with reverence. "Your family is protected. Let's go home." With effortless, muscular strength, Silas lifted Caleb completely out of the mud, supporting the tall rancher's weight as he helped him mount the bay gelding. Silas gathered the reins of his own buckskin stallion, stepping into the stirrup, taking the lead rope of Caleb's horse in his hand. Silas turned his horse toward the northern trail, leading his brother in arms down the center of Main Street. As they rode through the town, the crowds on the boardwalks parted in complete, reverent silence. Men slowly removed their hats, holding them against their chests. Storekeepers bowed their heads in shame and respect. And for the first time in the history of Blackwood Creek, not a single whisper of hatred followed the Apache scout as he rode out of the valley into the golden light of the mountain afternoon. The twilight that settled over the Blackwood Valley that evening was not cold. It was soft, golden violet, and hushed as if the entire territory were drawing a quiet breath of reverence. Inside the master bedchamber of the log ranch house, the world was bathed in the warm, dancing amber glow of a great riverstone fireplace. Thick split logs of mountain cedar and pinyon pine crackled softly on the iron grate, sending a sweet, resinous warmth into the room that held the creeping winter draft at bay. On the bedside table, 2 beeswax candles flickered in brass saucers, their golden halos illuminating the room with a gentle, sacred light. The air was rich with the comforting, domestic sense of a life well lived. The aromatic fragrance of cedar smoke, the sharp, clean tang of wild mountain mint steeping in an iron kettle on the hearth, and the sweet, lingering perfume of dried cherry blend pipe tobacco, the tobacco Caleb had smoked on the front porch during the quiet summer evenings of his youth. Upon the wide, heavy pine bed, Propped up against a mountain of soft feather pillows and covered in heavy woolen quilts, lay Caleb Sterling. The violent journey to town, the brutal confrontation with the syndicate in the freezing mud, and the long, agonizing ride home had consumed the very last reserves of his physical strength. His tall, broad-shouldered frame had withered until he looked almost weightless beneath the blankets. His leathery face was the color of weathered bone, his hollow cheeks dusted with the gray pallor of the grave, and his lips were stained with the dry, dark rust of the blood his diseased lungs could no longer contain. His breath came slow, shallow, and faint, a dry, rhythmic rattle that sounded like the autumn wind whispering through dry corn husks. Yet, as the candlelight danced across his features, Caleb's pale blue eyes were completely clear, devoid of pain, and filled with an ethereal, crystalline peace that seemed to look right through the wooden walls and into the stars beyond. He knew his trail had reached its end. The doctor's 2 months had run out in a single heroic afternoon. But as Caleb looked around the warm, timbered room, there was not a single trace of fear, bitterness, or regret in his soul. He had fought his battle. He had stood against the wolves. He had carried his brother's family across the burning sands of the frontier. And now, the sun was going down on his work. Caleb lifted his right hand, a hand that felt as light and cold as dry parchment, and gave a faint, trembling wave toward the doorway. Silas and Elena stepped into the room. Elena had washed the mud from her face, but her eyes were swollen, red, and glistening with a torrential flood of tears she could no longer hold back. She was trembling from head to foot, her hands clutching the edges of her forest-green shawl as she walked to the right side of the bed, sinking softly to her knees upon the braided wool rug. Silas walked to the left side of the bed. He had removed his scout's coat, wearing his plain blue flannel shirt, his long raven hair hanging loose around his broad bronze shoulders. The fierce, terrifying predator who had broken 3 men with his bare hands in the street an hour before was gone. In his place stood a man bowed in profound, heartbreaking reverence, his dark riverstone eyes shimmering with an unspeakable, agonizing sorrow. Caleb looked from Elena to Silas, a faint, beautiful smile touching his pale lips. "Don't weep, Elena," Caleb whispered, his voice barely louder than the crackle of the cedar coals on the hearth. A man couldn't ask for a better day to lay his burdens down. Elena reached out with both hands, gently, tenderly taking Caleb's cold, trembling fingers into her warm palms, bringing them to her lips, pressing her mouth against his knuckles as a broken sob tore from her chest. "You gave us everything, Caleb," she wept, her tears falling like warm rain upon his skin. "You took the shame. You took the hunger. You took the freezing cold so that Jesse and I could live. How can we ever let you go?" Caleb weakly turned his head on the pillow, his pale eyes looking into hers with an ocean of gentle, brotherly affection. "You don't owe me a single tear, little bird," Caleb said, his chest heaving with a slow, shallow breath. "When I found you freezing in that draw 3 winters back, I was a lonely man with nothing to live for but dirt and cattle. You and that boy. You gave me 2 years of a real home. You gave me a reason to wake up in the morning, and you gave me a family to fight for." Caleb paused, a dry, rattling cough catching in his throat, but he swallowed it down with iron willpower, refusing to let the disease steal his final words. He turned his gaze toward Silas, who stood motionless on the opposite side of the bed, his head bowed, his massive fists clenched at his sides as he fought to keep his own heart from tearing apart. "Step closer, brother," Caleb whispered. Silas knelt upon the rug beside the bed, bringing his face level with Caleb's. Caleb reached out with his left hand, his fingers trembling as he touched the thick, jagged scar along Silas's jawline, the scar from the Sonora saber that they had laughed about around campfires years before. "I kept the faith, Silas," Caleb murmured, his voice thick with a holy, unshakable pride. "I filed the deed with the territorial registrar before McCall shoved me. It's done. The water, the valley, the 5,000 acres. It belongs to Elena and Jesse now. The syndicate can't touch it. The law can't break it. You are the bravest man I ever rode with, Caleb," Silas rasped, his deep baritone cracking with a grief so immense that every word felt like swallowing fire. "You are more than my brother. You are the rock upon which my life was rebuilt." Caleb smiled a radiant, unburdened smile that seemed to banish every shadow from the room. With slow, deliberate effort, Caleb turned his hand where Elena was holding it. His fingers gently, tenderly touched the simple gold wedding band, resting on the third finger of Elena's left hand, the ring that had served as an iron wall of legal protection against a cruel territory for 2 long years. Caleb looked at Elena, his pale eyes blazing with absolute, undeniable truth. "The law has its papers, Elena," Caleb spoke, his voice steadying with the final, supreme authority of a dying man passing on his legacy. "And the town has its words. But God Almighty and the mountains know the truth." Caleb slowly lifted Elena's small, warm, delicate hand from the blanket. He reached across the bed, taking Silas's large, calloused, sun-darkened hand, the hand scarred by war, hardened by iron, and blessed by the sacred cattail pollen of the Chiricahua. With trembling, reverent fingers, Caleb Sterling took Elena's hand and placed it gently, securely, directly into the open palm of Silas Calloway. He folded their fingers together, pressing his own dying hands over their joined palms, sealing them in a single, unbroken bond of flesh, blood, and eternal devotion. Caleb looked straight into Silas's dark, riverstone eyes, his voice rising with a clear, ringing conviction that echoed through the quiet chamber like a sacred benediction. "You were her first love, Silas, and her only true one. Take back your life, take your woman, and teach my boy how to ride like the wind." In that singular, suspended, holy moment, the world stopped turning. The gold ring upon Elena's finger was no longer a symbol of separation. It was a memorial to the greatest sacrifice a brother could ever make. The 3 years of mourning, the cold grave in Sonora, the starvation in the snow, and the bitter dust of the frontier were all gathered into those joined hands and washed clean in the pure, unvarnished gold of Caleb's grace. Elena buried her face into Silas's shoulder, her tears soaking through his flannel shirt, her fingers curling tightly around his scarred palm with a love that defied the mortal earth. And then, the final, unbreakable armor of Silas Calloway gave way. The warrior who had survived the slaughter of Carrizo Canyon, the scout who had stared down charging cavalry and hostile rifles without a single flinch, bowed his head until his brow rested against their joined hands on the woolen quilt. And Silas wept. He did not weep with loud, dramatic cries. He wept with the silent, heavy, and soul-cleansing agony of an Apache warrior whose heart has been broken open by the beauty of a brother's sacrifice. Hot, heavy tears, tears of unspeakable gratitude, devastating grief, and eternal brotherhood fell from his dark riverstone eyes, dropping like liquid amber onto the cold, dying skin of Caleb's hands. Silas lifted his head, his face wet with tears, his dark eyes meeting Caleb's with a sacred, unshakable vow that was etched into his very spirit. "I swear to you, Caleb," Silas whispered, his voice trembling with a power that shook the room, "Jesse will know your name before he knows how to shoot. He will know that Caleb Sterling was the bravest, most noble man who ever drew breath in this territory. I will love Elena until my bones turn to dust, and I will defend this land with every drop of blood in my body. You have my word as an Apache warrior and your brother." Caleb let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of pure, absolute, and unadulterated peace. A soft, golden light seemed to settle over the dying rancher's face, smoothing away every line of pain, every trace of fever, and every shadow of exhaustion. "Good," Caleb murmured, his voice fading to a soft, sleepy whisper that was barely louder than the falling of the snow outside. "Then I can rest easy. The house is safe. The family is whole." Elena leaned down, her lips gently, tenderly pressing against Caleb's cool forehead, whispering a soft, tearful blessing into his gray hair. "Go with God, my sweet brother. Go to the green pastures where the breath is sweet and the trails never end. We will love you forever." Caleb's eyes slowly fluttered shut. His hand, resting over their joined fingers, relaxed, his knuckles growing still upon the woolen blanket. His chest rose one final, deep time, drinking in the sweet aroma of the cedar smoke and the cherry pipe tobacco, and then, with a soft, gentle sigh that floated up toward the ceiling, beams like a freed bird, Caleb Sterling took his final breath on this earth. The grandfather clock in the parlor ticked softly against the silence. The cedar logs in the hearth shifted, sending a small shower of golden embers dancing up the chimney into the Arizona night. Silas and Elena remained on their knees beside the bed, their hands intertwined over the still heart of the man who had saved them, weeping together in the quiet, sacred sanctuary of a love that had conquered death, honor, and time itself. The afternoon sun hung low and heavy over the western rim of the Dragoon Mountains, casting an apocalyptic, breathtaking wash of burning copper, deep violet, and liquid amber across the snow-covered expanse of the Arizona frontier. It was a bleak, majestic winter twilight, the kind of sunset that seemed to hush the entire wilderness, silencing the wind in the high canyons and turning the vast ocean of alabaster snow in the valley below into a shimmering plain of crushed amethyst and gold. Up on the highest crest of the Blackwood property, where the rocky pasture rose sharply to meet the sky, stood an ancient, solitary mountain cedar. The great tree had stood upon that wind-swept limestone ridge for more than 2 centuries, its massive, gnarled trunk twisted by 1,000 blizzards, its deep green boughs stretching wide against the clouds like an umbrella of living armor. From this high, sacred vantage point, a man could see the entire world, the sweeping meadows of the home ranch, the winding silver thread of Whispering Creek cutting through the cottonwoods, the distant roofs of Blackwood Creek, and the endless, blue-shadowed peaks of the Chiricahuas marching toward the Mexican line. It was the place Caleb Sterling had loved most in all the territory, and it was here, beneath the sheltering boughs of the great cedar, that Silas Calloway brought his brother home to rest. All through the freezing morning and the early hours of the afternoon, while the house lay wrapped in a solemn, sacred silence, Silas had worked in the horse barn by the golden light of a kerosene lantern. With his own large, scarred hands, Silas had selected the finest planks of cured ponderosa pine from the loft planks he had planed smooth, until the sweet scent of resin filled the barn. He had measured, cut, and joined the timber with heavy, square-headed iron nails, lining the interior with clean, white cotton sheets and a thick mattress of fragrant cedar shavings that Elena had gathered with her own hands. Together, with the gentle, tear-drenched reverence of true family, they had washed Caleb's body in sweet mountain spring water, combed his graying hair, and dressed the fallen rancher in his finest black wool territory suit, his polished cavalry boots, and the silver belt buckle he had worn as an army scout. When the casket was closed and sealed with iron screws, Silas had loaded the heavy pine box onto the bed of the ranch buckboard wagon, hitching Caleb's beloved bay gelding to the traces. Now, on the high, wind-swept crest of the hill, Silas stood alone beside the wagon, his coat tossed onto the wooden seat, his flannel sleeves rolled up past his muscular, bronze forearms. The earth on the high ridge was frozen solid as iron, a brutal 3-foot crust of packed ice, limestone shale, and red clay that would have broken the back of any ordinary man. Silas raised a heavy, forged steel pickaxe above his head. With a rhythmic, tireless power born of grief, honor, and raw physical fury, Silas drove the steel point down into the frozen ground. Clang! Sparks flew from the frozen granite, chipping away shards of ice and rock. Silas swung again. And again. Clang! Thud clang! For 4 grueling, agonizing hours, Silas did not stop. He did not pause to wipe the sweat that poured down his bronze face, freezing into salty crystals along his scarred jaw. He did not pause when the biting mountain wind whipped through his thin shirt, nor did he stop when the rough ash handle of the pickaxe wore through his leather work gloves, blistering the palms of his hands until his own blood seeped through the deerskin, staining the wood red. Elena had walked up the hill twice, bringing him hot coffee, begging him to rest his burning muscles, but Silas had gently, firmly shaken his head. In the ancient tradition of his mother's people, a warrior's grave must be carved from the earth by the hands of the brother who loved him. Every swing of the steel, every drop of blood that fell into the red dirt, and every stone wrenched from the frozen ground was a prayer, a sacred, physical payment of the unpayable debt of honor Silas owed to the man who had kept his wife and son from the grave. By the time the sun began its final, majestic descent behind the mountains, the trench was 6 feet deep, straight and true, lined with fresh cedar boughs to keep the cold granite from touching the pine wood. Elena walked up the snowy ridge, holding little Jessie's hand. She was wrapped in a long, heavy cloak of black wool, the hood pulled up against the freezing evening gale, her face pale, dignified, and serene, with a sorrow that had been washed clean of bitterness. Little Jessie was bundled in his thick shearling coat, wearing his small beaver fur cap. In his small, mittened hand, he clutched his carved cedar wolf tightly against his chest, his almond-shaped riverstone eyes wide with a quiet, solemn understanding that seemed far older than his 3 short years. Together, with the aid of 2 heavy hemp lariats looped beneath the pine box, Silas and Elena, gently, slowly lowered the casket into the deep red earth. The rope groaned against the cedar roots as the box settled onto the fragrant bed of evergreens. Elena stepped to the edge of the open grave. From her cloak, she brought forth her mother's worn, black leather Bible. With a voice that was soft, clear, and steady against the howling of the mountain wind, she read the words that had brought comfort to frontier mothers for generations. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness, for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." When the prayer was finished, Silas stepped forward with the heavy spade. With slow, reverent strokes, he filled the grave with the rich, red earth of the Arizona mountains, packing the soil firmly until a neat, dignified mound rose beneath the spreading branches of the ancient cedar. At the head of the grave, Silas set a massive, hand-dressed slab of solid mountain oak that he had planed and carved by firelight. Deeply branded into the face of the oak, sealed with hot pine resin to withstand 100 winters of rain and snow, were the words, "Caleb Sterling, 1,850, 1,886. A brother in blood, a shield in the storm." He kept the promise. Silas knelt in the snow before the headstone, his large, scarred hands resting upon the cold oak. From his elk-hide medicine pouch, Silas brought forth a single, magnificent feather, the barred black and white tail feather of a mature golden eagle, the highest, most sacred token of valor and spiritual purity in the Chiricahua Nation. Silas pressed the quill of the feather deep into the notch at the top of the oak headstone, securing it with a braided strand of sweetgrass and wild mountain sage. He raised his bronze face to the fiery, violet heavens, closing his eyes as the evening wind swept his long raven hair across his shoulders. And there, standing on the high ridge beneath the setting sun, Silas spoke the ancient, sacred farewell of the Apache scout to a fallen brother. "Enju, my brother, walk in beauty. The long trail is over, and the war is done. Go now to the high mountains where the water runs clear and the grass is always green. The Dine open their lodges to receive a warrior of honor. Your name will live in the songs of our son, and your spirit will guard this valley as long as the stars look down upon the earth. Rest well, my brother. We will hold the line." Elena knelt beside Silas in the snow, her arm wrapping around his broad shoulders. She took Jesse's small hand, guiding his little fingers as the child placed a fresh, fragrant sprig of mountain evergreen and a small, smooth river stone upon the center of the mound. Little Jesse looked up at the oak headstone, then looked into the fiery, purple sky above the Dragoon Peaks, where the first evening star was beginning to glitter with crystalline brilliance. "Uncle Caleb is an eagle now, Mama?" the little boy asked softly, his sweet, innocent voice cutting through the solemn hush of the ridge. "He's flying with the Great Spirit?" Elena choked back a fresh tear, kissing her son's bronze cheek, smiling through her weeping. "Yes, my sweet boy. He is an eagle now. He is watching over us from the high sky." Silas stood slowly, his massive frame rising against the blazing crimson horizon like a pillar of living iron. He reached down, scooping little Jesse up into his powerful left arm, settling the boy securely against his broad chest. The child nuzzled his head into Silas's neck, his small arm wrapping around his father's collar, holding his cedar wolf out toward the sunset, as if showing the wooden totem to the spirit of the man buried beneath the cedar. Silas reached out his right arm, wrapping his strong hand securely around Elena's waist, drawing her close against his side. The 3 of them stood together on the high crest of the ridge, completely silhouetted against the magnificent, dying fire of the Arizona sun. The bitter mountain wind swept across the peak, catching Elena's dark cloak and Silas's hair, howling softly through the branches of the ancient cedar tree like a solemn, eternal hymn. And in that singular, breathtaking moment, as the purple shadows of the desert rose to meet the night, the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 3 years finally lifted and blew away on the wind. The grief, the loneliness, the starvation, the lie of the War Department, and the agonizing distance of the grave were all surrendered to the earth. What remained upon that ridge was something pure, unbreakable, and eternal. A family forged in the fires of suffering, bound together by the sacred sacrifice of a brother, and anchored in a love that had proven itself stronger than death itself. Silas turned his head, his dark riverstone eyes looking down into Elena's hazel gaze. She looked up at him, her tears drying in the cold wind, her lips parting in a soft, quiet smile of unshakable devotion. She rested her hand over his heart, feeling the powerful, steady thumping of his pulse beneath his shirt, her anchor, her warrior, her husband. "We are home, Silas," Elena whispered softly against the wind. "We are home, my love," Silas replied, his deep baritone thick with an eternal promise. Together, the three of them turned their backs on the setting sun and looked down toward the valley floor. Down in the basin, nestled peacefully among the snow-laden cottonwoods, the log ranch house waited, its stone chimney sending up a warm, welcoming plume of cedar smoke into the gathering dusk. The peace had been bought with blood and tears, and as the first cold shadows of the night enveloped the Dragoon Mountains, Silas Calloway held his family tight against his chest, ready to defend the sacred life they had reclaimed against any darkness that dared to cross their horizon. The night that fell over the Arizona frontier, following Caleb Sterling's burial, was unlike any darkness the valley had ever known. Above the jagged limestone silhouettes of the Dragoon Mountains, the stars vanished completely, swallowed beneath a vast, suffocating ceiling of bruised, pitch-black storm clouds. A heavy, unnatural stillness settled over the frozen snowdrifts, a suffocating, electric vacuum that made the hair on the back of a man's neck stand on end. From the high mountain canyons to the north, a deep, guttural rumble of winter thunder rolled across the high desert basin, vibrating through the living rock like the distant, rhythmic pounding of a giant war drum. The wind was rising, cold, sharp, and smelling of ozone, wet iron, and approaching fire. 10 miles to the south, where the territorial stage road crossed the rocky border wash, the flickering yellow light of kerosene lanterns spilled out from the windows of the Crossroads Saloon. Inside the smoke-choked, foul-smelling roadhouse, the atmosphere was thick with a murderous, drunken tension. Sitting at the center oak table, his heavy beaver fur coat draped over his shoulders, was Vance McCall. The syndicate boss was a terrifying sight. His tailored black suit was stained with dried red mud. His left side was bound tightly in blood-soaked linen bandages that held his broken ribs in place, and his face was a pale, sweating mask of agonizing pain and venomous, psychotic humiliation. Every shallow breath he drew sent a jolt of fire through his crushed chest, and every throb of agony fueled a raging, unquenchable inferno of hatred in his soul. He had been broken in the street. He had been brought to his knees in the mud by a half-breed scout in front of the entire county. Surrounding McCall's table were 12 of the most ruthless, heavily armed mercenaries the Arizona borderlands had ever spawned. They were hard-eyed killers, ex-Quantrill bushwhackers, dishonorably discharged cavalry deserters, and border cutthroats who had fled murder warrants in Texas and Mexico. They wore low-slung, tied-down holsters with ivory-handled Colt revolvers, heavy sheepskin coats lined with cartridge loops, and held repeating Winchester carbines across their knees. Upon the wooden floorboards around them sat the instruments of their trade. 6 heavy wooden crates packed with 5-gallon glass jugs of kerosene, bundles of pitch-soaked pine torches, and 3 wooden boxes of mining dynamite with coils of waterproof fuse. Vance McCall slammed his silver-topped cane down onto the table with a violent, trembling thud, his pale eyes burning with mad, unrestrained fury. "Listen to me, every last one of you," McCall snarled, his voice a hoarse, ragged hiss that dripped with malice. "Sterling is dead. My spies in town confirmed they buried the bastard on the ridge this afternoon. There's no one left in that house, but a weeping woman, a bastard child, and that redskin scout." McCall leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his cane, his gaze sweeping across the 12 stone-faced killers. "We don't take prisoners tonight. We ride into the Blackwood draw before the storm breaks. You splash that kerosene across the barn, the corrals, and the porch. You light the torches, and you burn that whole damn spread to ash. When that Indian runs out to save his woman, you put 20 rounds of lead through his chest. You shoot the woman, and you make sure that boy never draws another breath on this earth." McCall tossed a heavy canvas bag onto the table, the linen splitting open to reveal a glittering pile of double eagle $20 gold coins that clattered across the wood. "500 in gold for every man who brings me Calloway's scalp," McCall hissed, his teeth bared in a feral, bloodthirsty grin. "Mount up, boys. By sunrise, the Blackwood Valley will belong to the dead." The 12 gunmen gave a low, sinister chorus of drunken cheers, scooping up the gold, grabbing the kerosene jugs and the torches, and stroking the hammers of their rifles as they stepped out into the freezing midnight darkness. A moment later, the deafening thunder of 24 iron-shod hooves tore through the night, galloping north through the freezing mud, carrying a wave of fire and slaughter toward the unsuspecting valley. Inside the log ranch house of the Blackwood spread, the world was wrapped in a deep, sacred silence. The parlor was dark, illuminated only by the faint, pulsing crimson glow of the cedar embers resting in the great Riverstone fireplace. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked softly, marking the quiet, rhythmic passage of the midnight hour. At the heavy pine kitchen table, sitting by the faint, flickering halo of a single tallow candle, sat Silas Calloway. The time for mourning had ended. The warrior had taken the field. Silas sat bare-chested in the dim light, his massive, bronze shoulders and broad chest bearing the pale, jagged silver scars of his military service. His long, raven hair was unbound, falling straight and wild past his shoulder blades like the mane of a war stallion. His face was cold, chiseled, and completely devoid of fear, an ancient, stone mask of supreme, lethal concentration. On the table before him lay his arsenal, laid out with the meticulous, mechanical precision of a master scout preparing for a siege. With slow, practiced, rhythmic movements, Silas worked. He took his Winchester repeater, working the lever with a smooth, silent stroke, inspecting the polished steel bolt. He fed 14 heavy, brass-cased, 44-40 cartridges into the magazine tube beneath the barrel, each round clicking home with a crisp, oily clack. He set the rifle down and reached for his twin heavy Colt .45 cavalry revolvers. He slid the loading gates open, spinning the 6-shot cylinders with a dry, mechanical whir, inspecting the copper primer caps on every cartridge. He cocked each hammer to half-cock, oiled the cylinder pins with a drop of pure rendered bear grease, and slid the heavy, blued steel revolvers into the oiled leather holsters of his twin cross-draw gun belt. Then, Silas reached for his antler-handled hunting knife. From his deerskin pouch, he brought forth a flat, gray river whetstone, wetting the surface with a few drops of mountain spring water. Holding the heavy, 10-inch carbon steel blade at a precise 15-degree angle, Silas began to hone the edge. The rhythmic, hypnotic rasp of steel against stone filled the quiet room, a song of cold, coming death that matched the low, distant rumble of the thunder, shaking the window panes. He stroked the blade until the edge was so terrifyingly sharp that it could split a floating silk ribbon in midair. When the knife was returned to its beaded deerskin sheath, Silas performed the most sacred ritual of his mother's people. From a small, carved stone bowl on the table, Silas took a piece of charred mountain cedar from the hearth fire and a chunk of red iron ochre gathered from the sacred red bluffs of the dragoons. He ground the charcoal and the ochre together in a small stone mortar, adding 3 drops of wild mountain pine resin and a splash of water, mixing the minerals into a thick, dark, and oily paste. Silas dipped the 2 middle fingers of his right hand into the black and red paste. He looked into the small, square shaving mirror propped against the candle on the table. With steady, deliberate, and ancient strokes, Silas drew the traditional war paint of the Chiricahua scout across his face. He drew 2 thick, jagged black lines from the corners of his dark riverstone eyes down across his high bronze cheekbones to his jawline, the mark of the hunting wolf that tracks in the dark. Across his broad forehead, from temple to temple, he drew a single, bold band of deep crimson red ochre, the mark of the warrior who fights for the blood of his family and will not surrender the earth. As the paint dried against his bronze skin, Silas Calloway was no longer a civilian homesteader. He was no longer an outcast living between two worlds. He was the living, breathing ghost of the Chiricahua, the ancient, unconquered spirit of the desert mountains, awakened to defend his sacred sanctuary against the wolves. Silas rose slowly to his feet, strapping his heavy cartridge bandoliers across his bare, painted chest, buckling his gun belt around his waist, and sliding his hunting knife into its sheath at his right hip. He turned and walked with silent, soundless footsteps across the woven rugs, stepping softly through the arched doorway into the nursery. The small room was warm, smelling of shaved cedar and sweet chamomile. Inside the handcrafted cedar crib, little Jesse lay sleeping peacefully beneath his patchwork quilt. The little boy was curled on his side, his soft, regular breathing filling the room with the innocent, holy melody of life. His small, chubby hand was curled around the carved cedar wolf, holding the fragrant red wood against his cheek as he dreamed of soaring eagles and mountain ponies. Silas knelt down beside the crib, his massive, painted frame casting a towering, protective shadow across the wooden rails. With infinite, trembling tenderness, the fierce warrior leaned down, his lips softly, reverently pressing against his son's warm, bronze forehead. Silas closed his eyes, placing his hand over the child's small chest, whispering a soft Chiricahua father's prayer into the boy's dark raven hair. "Sleep in beauty, my son. Your father is the mountain. Your father is the storm. No harm will touch your bed tonight." Silas rose to his feet and turned toward the doorway. Elena stood in the shadow of the threshold. She had not been sleeping. She was dressed in a dark flannel shirt, a heavy deerskin vest, and sturdy riding skirts, her honey chestnut hair braided neatly down her back. Her face was pale in the dim light of the tallow candle, but her hazel eyes were completely dry, clear, fierce, and blazing with the unyielding, magnificent courage of a frontier woman standing beside her warrior. She did not weep. She did not beg him to stay inside. She knew who he was, and she knew the price that freedom demanded on this wild earth. Elena took 2 slow, deliberate steps into the room. In her hands, she held her father's heavy, side-by-side 10-gauge double-barrel shotgun, an ancient, devastating weapon with twin brown steel barrels and heavy rabbit-ear hammers. Across her shoulder was slung a canvas bandolier filled with heavy, brass-cased shells loaded with double-aught lead buckshot. Elena stepped up to Silas, her hazel eyes looking straight up into his dark, war-painted riverstone gaze. With steady, reverent hands, Elena lifted the heavy 10-gauge shotgun, placing the cold iron and polished walnut stock directly into Silas's large, scarred hands. She rested her small, warm palm flat against his bare, painted chest, feeling the powerful, steady thumping of his warrior heart beating against her fingers. She reached up with her other hand, gently touching the turquoise amulet resting against her own throat, then traced the sharp line of his jaw, her voice a low, steady, and unbreakable vow that echoed with the fierce devotion of a lifetime. "They came to burn our home, Silas. They came to kill our boy." Elena leaned up on her toes, pressing her soft lips against his mouth in a fierce, breathless, and consuming kiss that tasted of salt, fire, and eternal love. When she pulled back, her eyes blazed into his with the unshakable fire of the frontier. "Bring our tomorrow home, Silas." Silas's hands closed tightly around the heavy twin barrels of the shotgun. His dark eyes flashed with an ancient, terrifying, and beautiful fire that had conquered death, war, and the grave. "Lock the heavy oak bar across the door, Elena," Silas whispered, his deep baritone dropping to a cold, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the very floorboards. "Stay with our son in the center room. Do not open that door for any sound until you hear my voice call your name." Silas turned, took up his Winchester in his left hand and the 10-gauge shotgun in his right, and walked silently across the parlor. He opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the howling, pitch-black midnight storm. Outside, the first heavy drops of freezing winter rain began to fall against the snow, accompanied by a deafening, blinding flash of blue lightning that tore across the peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. In the distance, the muffled thunder of 24 galloping hooves reached the mouth of the canyon. Silas Calloway pulled the brim of his hat low over his painted brow, stepped off the porch into the freezing darkness, and melted into the shadows of the timber like a ghost entering his kingdom. The battle for the Blackwood Valley had begun. And so, my dear friends, our breath catches in our throats as we bring part 4 of Where the Desert Remembers to an electrifying, heart-pounding close here on Eagle Eye Apache, as Vance McCall and 12 heavily armed, bloodthirsty mercenaries ride into the snow-choked canyon with torches, dynamite, and rifles. How will one lone Apache warrior, armed with ancient tracking wisdom and an unbreakable love, wage war in the freezing dark? When the flames rise against the timber, who will stand and who will fall in the final reckoning of the frontier? And will Silas Calloway truly bring their tomorrow home? I want to hear from every single one of you tonight. If you were standing on that porch with Silas, feeling the thunder shake the mountains, what would be running through your heart? And what do you think of Elena's unyielding courage as a mother and a wife on this unforgiving frontier? Please, take a moment to leave your thoughts, your prayers, and your reflections in the comments below. Let me know where you are listening from tonight, across our great nation, whether you are gathered around your kitchen table, keeping warm by your hearth fire, or listening under the quiet of the night sky. Your presence, your words, and your loyalty are the greatest blessings of our storytelling family. If this chapter moved your spirit and made you feel the true power of brotherly sacrifice, maternal strength, and warrior honor, please hit that like button, share this video with your family and friends who cherish epic frontier tales, and make sure you are subscribed to Eagle Eye Apache with all your notifications turned on. Join us very soon for the grand, breathtaking finale, Part 5. The blossom on the mesa where the long winter will finally break. The wolves will face their ultimate judgment, and the eternal promise made beneath the desert stars will find its glorious, tear-drenched fulfillment. Until our trails cross at the final fire, my friends, walk with honor, hold your family close, and may the good Lord protect and keep you safe through every storm. Good night.